in that great library. He's had extensive publication in the field of books, manuscripts, and reading, and developing of silent reading, the separation of words, the physiology of reading. One example being a 1997 book called Space Between Words, The Origins of Silent Reading. And his subject this afternoon is from Compilatio to Cursiva, the role of media in the genesis of genius, 1400 to 1600.
Taking advantage of the fact that this is a conference on drafts, I'd like to confess that the title I gave to the organizers of the conference was a draft, and when I actually wrote it up, I changed it to, and perhaps it fits in better with the conversation today, Paper, Cursive Writing and Printing, the contribution of changing media to the history of the creative process. As I began to contemplate composing this paper, I had a long conversation with a distinguished New York antiquarian bookseller. Why, I asked him, do people collect autographed literary manuscripts? Without hesitating, he responded, to make a lot of money. But this, of course, begs the real question. Why do collectors offer large sums to possess autographs of manuscripts and original typescripts of famous writers, composers, historians, and scientists? If, for example, someone in England should find in a hidden drawer of an antique desk an autographed manuscript of Shakespeare's Hamlet, why would it be of inestimable value? The response, I believe, would be trifold. First, an autograph of a literary manuscript is a secular relic, like a bona fide fragment from St. Thomas's skull or the Shroud of Turin. Such an object, were it to be veritable, tangibly links us to a personage of the past. The desire to feel physically close to our literary forebears is human and natural, shared by the most humble and the most erudite. A second and more substantive reason is that an autograph guarantees the authenticity of a composition and implicitly of a special textual tradition. Thus, codices spuriously attributed to the hand of Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose were both regarded as relics of these saints and guarantors of the authorship of celebrated and venerated patristic works. Important as the aforementioned roles of the autographed manuscript are, and have been from medieval times onward, another and most important role of the autograph is to give insight into the authorial process. Since at least the 19th century, students of literary history have searched for and carefully preserved manuscripts that record by erasure, marginal, and interlineal annotations, notes de renvoi, arrows, and like marks, the creative process by which a first draft evolves into a memorable and fully confected masterpiece. It is important when we turn to antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early Renaissance to realize that autographs of this character that provide such insight into the creative process are either entirely absent or scarcely present. The autograph attributed falsely to Virgil is a calligraphic manuscript. Equally calligraphic are the codices spuriously attributed to the late antique church fathers like Augustine. The illuminations and paintings of the Middle Ages and Renaissance that show Cicero, Augustine, Ambrose writing their compositions are in fact anachronistic. The Greeks and Romans, and here I differ somewhat with the previous speaker, generally composed in dictation to secretaries, who took down their words in syllabic shorthand, either on wax tablets or in parchment notebooks. The antecedents of the medieval codex that before the 3rd century were used primarily for provisional notes and not for a confected text, for which the appropriate medium would have been the laterally extending scroll. Rare indeed were figures like Ambrose, who are known and who wrote about and who acknowledged to writing their own letters and tracts. As I have explained elsewhere, the ancient culture of belles lettres was largely an oral one, in which the process of composition, like that of reading, was habitually vocal. The contraction of the classical world of letters, with its division of labor between authors, secretaries, and professional readers within the confines of monastic communities such as Cassiodorus' retreat at Vivarium, undoubtedly brought authors into more intimate contact with the books that contained their texts, which by this date were almost exclusively in codex form. Cassiodorus was concerned with text formats that would simplify reading, such as the lines of sense, per colla et commata, espoused by Jerome to aid simple confreres, punctuation, and perhaps even the incipient aeration characteristic of certain late antique Christian codices written in scriptura continua, or continuous writing. But we must remember in all this that writing at the time of the ancients and in the Roman Empire and for the whole period of Greek antiquity, there were no spaces between words and virtually no punctuation. Elsewhere, I've set forth the general thesis that the full word separation that came to characterize all insular Latin script in the late 8th century permitted the evolution of silent reading. Logically, this new script that enabled the silent and entirely visual decoding of text would have fostered silent autograph composition. However, the use of wax tablets and of parchment booklets similar to those employed in late antiquity has left us bereft of any tangible evidence of authorial autograph activity in the British Isles, where at any rate most surviving Latin books were copies of the Gospels. Johannes Scotus, an Irishman at the court of Charles the Bald in the 9th century, however, left word-separated corrections as additions to the formal scribal transcriptions of his works, which had been copied from prior drafts by continental hands in unseparated script. Word separation, which enhanced the manipulation of written text, was a prerequisite for the modern draft autograph. Authorial codices, that is, text written in formal book script with occasional corrections reasonably attributable to the author, became characteristic of word-separated literary circles from the time of Johannes Scotus to the end of the 10th and into the early 11th century. There are a number of examples, of which the most famous is Reicher's Chronicle of the Franks, which exists in only one codex in Bamberg, which has some revisions in it. Others include the Jests of the Bishops of Cambrai, which is associated in the 11th century with Gerard of Cambrai, which has authorial, thought to be authorial marks in it and revisions. Another with far fewer marks is the reputed authorial codex containing the poem of which Alberon of Laon composed for King Robert the Pious. At St. Gall, the earliest major continental center of word separation, Noker Balbulus, the author of liturgical texts in the early 10th century, explicitly refers to the notebooks that he used for composing preliminary versions of his works. Notebooks, along with wax tablets that surely continued to serve an important draft function for the authorial creative process. 10th and 11th century examples of such artifacts, however, scarcely survive. Indeed, we only have a single example of a codex which might be deemed a notebook, and only a very few wax tablets, none of which bear witness to autograph composition. However, in literary text, the increasing practice of composing in written form has left its traces. Guibert de Nogent, at the end of his life, lamented that due to incipient blindness he could no longer write his text, but was obliged to dictate to a secretary. The case of Guibert is particularly revealing, for although quite clearly somewhat of an eccentric, he felt free in written form to write erotic poems and record disturbing dreams and fantasies which, it is fair to speculate, he might have been more hesitant to divulge orally to his secretary. Even earlier, Othman de Saint-Amaron, active in an early South German center of word separation, expressed his own neurotic fantasies within the new medium. Abelard's History of his Calamities is a 12th century example of this genre. However, the artifacts that might have documented the documentation, the drafting of such composition of these works of a highly personal character have all vanished. If the medium of word-separated script enhanced the propensity of authors on occasion to write their own compositions and, more frequently, to correct and modify a composition transcribed by secretaries, the writing materials of the pre-scholastic period and later of the scholastic age were still not conducive to the use of the pen as a primary instrument for composition. Parchment was expensive, as the point has been made today, and relative both to ancient papyrus and modern paper, a difficult support on which to write. Wax tablets constituted a more user-friendly alternative for short sections of text, but because of their limited surface, they were clearly incapable of receiving a full draft of an entire opus. It is thus within the demi-oral milieu of scholastic composition characteristic of universities in the Central Middle Ages that the enigmatic vocabulary for the authorial composition of medieval composition must be assessed. Here the term dictare retained its ancient meaning of composing orally a text, although on occasion the verb might also be used to refer to text composed entirely in written form. The verb dictare is in the sense of reading aloud a fully composed text as a means of rapidly producing copies occurred really only after the year 1400. Dictare was indeed the normal word for literary composition and could refer to either written composition or oral composition. At the same time, the term scribere was replete with comparable ambiguity. St. Bonaventure, in a famous passage of his preface to his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, enunciated 4 meanings of scribere that might be, for simplicity, be summarized as 3 separate activities. For Bonaventure, scribere, to write, might refer to the activity of copying, that is, of book production, the activity of compiling, that is, of copying and extracting and combining texts of works of recognized authors, and implicitly of reordering these works with subdivisions to enhance their clarity, and lastly, the activity of authoring, that is, the expression of the writer's own opinions in what we would term original written composition. Before the late 14th century, the oral dimension of composition was most important in those varieties of text that were most distinctly removed from the process of compilatio. The epistle and the sermon were 2 genres which included, which were usually short works that to a large degree were spontaneously generated viva voce. In contrast, the written dimensions of authorship is most in evidence in the scholastic genres that included compilations of canon law, commentaries of the sentences of Peter Lombard, commentaries on Scripture, commentaries on Aristotle, and in their derivatives, the summas of theological thought. Here the process of ordinatio and compilatio were most in evidence, and as Bonaventure's remarks suggest, in such works the tasks of author and of scribe impinged upon each other. In the 14th and 15th centuries, scholastic writers increasingly dissected, segmented, and recombined chunks of prose drawn from both the ancient fathers and 13th century masters. We moderns tend to think of that composing a late scholastic work such as Jean Versour's commentary on Aristotle's Ethics and the copying of a book of hours such as Newberry Library Manuscript 56, the Hours of Marguerite of Croix, were by definition totally different ventures. And yet, viewed in a larger perspective, the processes were, as Bonaventure's remarks imply, profoundly related. Versour, the author, acted as scribe when he derived blocks of sentences from the interior commentaries of Albert Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and Johannes Buridan. His original contribution lay chiefly in the nuances of his responses to pre-established questions. That which was unique was a very small percentage of the entire prose content of his tome. Similarly, the scribe of each book of hours was an author in the sense that he chose and sequenced the devotional prayers that might compose a large portion of his volume. As scribe compiler, he had the liberty to add nuances by rephrasing the rubrics indicating the modes and uses of prayer. These brief textual elements that constitute a minuscule percentage of the prose content of a book of hours, to the modern scholar may be among its most original and significant aspects. In the milieu of the Carthusian convent of the 15th century, the scholastic mode of written composition through compilation reached its zenith in a world of solitary silence. In the massive opera of Denis the Carthusian that fills over 40 printed volumes, virtually the entire content is a syncretic ordinatio of prose elements drawn from the Fathers, earlier scholastics, and liturgy. Three highly significant changes are responsible for the evolution of the autographed manuscript into a document conducive of preserving a record of authorial creativity, the very document that collectors so want to achieve and to possess. The first of these was the introduction of paper, beginning in the late 14th century, as paper for books as opposed to paper for documents. Paper preempted the use of wax tablets and provided a medium for authorial composition potentially suitable for preservation. 15th century paper codices, particularly those of the Carthusian order, offer us far more tangible examples of the medieval compilatio than survived for the central Middle Ages. And if I could have the lights in the first slide here. Can we dim the lights, please? How do we get this? Oh, there we are. This is a manuscript of the Newberry Library. It's an autographed compilation of Johannes Hagen, a mid-15th century Carthusian friar who wrote, as was the medieval custom, extracts from the church fathers and composed his own works. And all of this material was bound up together and undoubtedly saved because he was an important personage in the convent of Erfurt. And you can see on the right, he just writes onto this snip of paper, which you can see on the next slide. It's really a used piece of document. And this codex it just shows how paper became available. And snips of paper were used for this purpose as for draft writing materials, drafts of compilations, not drafts in the creative sense that some of us have been talking about today. Concomitantly with this introduction of paper, a revolution in binding that enabled codices to be shelved vertically accidentally provided in the leaves and paste downs a locus for paper fragments of draft compositions to be preserved. This is another Carthusian manuscript from which the paste downs have what we believe to be autographed notes of another Carthusian friar, Heinrich Reicher, who is in fact the author of the textual of the bulk of this manuscript. In the earlier Middle Ages, it may be, we're not at all sure, that paste downs and fly leaves to a certain degree were. They certainly became much more common in the 15th century. So we had two things happening. One, we have paper allowing, giving more material evidence, and two, we have a change in binding and a mammoth effort of rebinding old libraries that meant that many fragments and things that would not have been kept retained prior to 1400 were retained, if only by accident. An additional technique linked to the draft autograph was the development of cursive writing. The friendlier support of paper doubtlessly encouraged writing in which the ductus necessitated minimal liftings of the quill from the page. In contrast to antiquity, when Ambrose regarded writing scriptura continua as a mode of composition slower than dictation, cursive word-separated writing on paper provided a rapid medium, highly suitable for capturing the creative process in situ. The use of cursive writing for the vernacular, which in the course of the 15th century constituted an ever-increasing portion of the handwritten literary pages produced, encouraged a disjunction between written composition and the activity of compilatio, linked to quarrying the Latin corpus of scholastic texts, and thereby encouraged a more spontaneous expression of thought in written form. In Latin, the disjunction was encouraged even more by 15th century humanism, with its emphasis on rhetorical eloquence and moral philosophy as opposed to logic, theology, and law. Humanists were drawn to the cursive script as a fit medium for the expression of the new ideal of discursive written rhetoric. Indeed, the first truly substantial autographed manuscripts revealing the spark of creativity were produced by humanists in Italy in the mid-15th century. A startling example is the extensive draft autograph of George of Trevisan, preserved in a Newberry Library manuscript. And here we have it, and if I can, you have the cursive writing, ordinary writing. This is a whole choir added onto a book which he himself copied out in a formal book spread. And here in these smudged portions, you really have writing over erasure. And to get a better idea of this, here is the beginning of these autographs. This was also his writing as a scribe, his own scribe, writing out his own. But this is a second recension, which material was added in the margins, and when space went into the margins, a whole additional section of text was added in a separate choir. Such draft autographs were rarely preserved. This one preserved only because it was completing an already existent book. And no comparable informal drafts have yet been discovered for Leonardo Bruni or Marsilio Ficino. But preserved or not, and additional examples may yet be found in 15th century bindings, they came to exist as paper and cursive writing combined to form a theater suitable for the creative process to be recorded. Printing provided the final ingredient for the triumph of autograph composition. In the first half of the 15th century, all scholars, including professional humanists, were scribes as well as authors, the distinction between these two functions being arbitrary. They were trained in a hierarchy of scripts. Except for such exceptional cases as the Trebizond Codex, the author was calligraphically in an expert manner, recopied his own text and destroyed his draft. Heinrich Reicher, his treatise on divine wisdom, bears the inscription that this was a copy that the author had scripsit et conscripsit. That is, he composed in written form, and then he engrossed as in a prepared fair copy. Even the illumination initials of this manuscript were likely his. And here you see. This is a later inscription saying that he wrote this book on the top on the right. If I can master this. Oh, I have this, like this. That's saying he wrote it and conscribed it, engrossed it. This is probably his autograph or cursive hand of composition. This is his formal bookhand, in which there are a few authorial corrections, much as one would have found in a manuscript of the 11th or 12th century. And these are the initials, which, because they are so folkloric in quality, are likely his, but not the initials of a trained decorator, but of a Carthusian who worked in purposely was encouraged to work in strict isolation. Christine de Pizan employed a special script with its own orthography as an autograph script of composition, but only traces of it exist in marginalia and in the fair copies that she and her assistants, including her own illuminators, prepared. In contrast, the earlier generation, Erasmus and students regarded handwritten leaves as the confected written stage of composition to be turned over to a printer for publication. I think this is what I would like, and maybe if I'm speaking too long, is to say that this unity between scribe and author, in other words, in which the author was his own scribe, in which there was almost a purposeful, indeed a purposeful destruction of the evidence of composition, this bond was broken by the introduction of printing. And with Erasmus, we have the first important author who is remembered for his cursive autographs. And in fact, the painting of Erasmus, famous portrait of Erasmus, we see him writing in cursive script in a book. And this is very significant because Erasmus himself left us drafts which really meet the criteria, which I think has been indicated before, of being a draft. His autograph manuscripts, celebrated one of which exists in Copenhagen, actually have variants which were revised out. It is a draft. It is different from the first edition, which he purposely supervised. So we have that kind of experimentation with prose, which we recognize in authorial literary manuscripts. And in works like the Adagia, which over a period of 30 or 40 years grew greatly in complexity, successive editions were augmented by this process. This book was sold about a decade ago at Sotheby's, which is copiously documented, annotated by Erasmus in his autograph hand with revisions. And included in that book are interleaved editions, similar to those that I showed you on the Erfurt Codex, where, in fact, here these are not compilations in the medieval sense, but really digressions and authorial formulations, which are in turn corrected in the process by annotations, and which were later corrected and amended when the book was set into print through the proofs. And Erasmus took a great interest in the printing of his own works. Here we have the culmination of this. Freed from scribal conventions that viewed marginalia as access aids for future readers, Erasmus used printed volumes, as I've said, not his own fair copies as the substratum to be used for revision and edition. Michel de Montaigne used a paper-printed copy of his essays in precisely the same manner. With these discursive humanists writing in cursive script, free from the media and conventions of scholasticism, the autograph of genius, so valued by modern collectors, was born.